Hello, I'm Tommy Moore from the Bartitsu Lab, and in this video I want to discuss the idea of prioritisation. Now, many arts that focus on self-defence and self-protection, they prioritise their curriculum. And one of the things I find quite interesting is what different combative systems decide to prioritise for. And bear in mind that most normal people, this isn't their main hobby, this isn't their main interest. It might be something that normal people do once or twice a week. They're not always churning it over. So I think as instructors, as people that love this stuff, we sometimes assume that because we churn it over and think things through all the time and read all the material and watch all the videos and do all the training, that others are too. And frankly, that's not the case. Most people that come to a self-defense, self-protection class, many instructors, it's a very limited and small part of their time. So I wanted to look at how we prioritise and what's the science behind the prioritisation. And hopefully it helps you reflect on what you're prioritising and how you're teaching, and that will always help you evaluate. I'm from an educational background, so for me, being able to re-evaluate what you're doing in light of your aims and ambitions, that's a very important thing to do. And you should never be too proud of your syllabus or of your approach or of your techniques or of your angles or of your timings to change that. And I think one thing that's quite interesting is I've put this together, and you'll see more of this than you will of me. And this is essentially the two axes by which I personally judge self-protection and self-defense. And that is danger and likelihood or frequency. Now, as you can see here, so a level 10 danger event where danger to your life and the life of your loved ones, the absolute failure being death, up here, 10, naturally. Okay? But its likelihood is very small. But if it does happen, your chance of impending death via gunmen, via explosive devices, via trucks being driven down boulevards, by knife attacks in tourist hotspots, your chance of death is high when it comes to that. Then you start to move down, and I've plotted these here subjectively based on my opinion and my experience, but again, a lot of people have varying versions, but this helps me plot out where my mind is at. So you can see here, these would be events of psychopathic or sociopathic violence. So you get a lot of attacks from people that are mentally ill. A lot of people that are mentally ill can't be easily reasoned with. There's not much you can do. A lot of that violence is asocial. So therefore the threat level is quite high for people. If you think of the city of London, there are a lot of fatal attacks by people that are just aren't right. And those naturally take their place in a high danger but low likelihood position. And I've also got here, in parallel to that, group social violence. So this is social violence, i.e. pub, club, whatever, football match, but there is more than one individual. There is more than one individual. Now normally an institute of social violence could be a relatively low risk because those kind of smaller fracas, a couple of punches, couple of kicks, you might get a couple of digs when you're down, but that's usually the end of it. As soon as it gets to multiple people, your chance of having something very life-threatening happen to you, because all the kicks and stomps to your head, the damage of your head hitting the ground, it deservedly has its place here on the relatively mid to high danger level. But again, we're more frequent than a terror attack, but we're not all the way into infrequent territory here. So group social violence and psychopathic or sociopathic violence. As we start to move into the amber zone here, we start to see things like home invasion or armed robbery. Now, when you start to think of home invasion or robbery, there is a product in mind. They want your money, they want your vehicles, they want your valuables. It's transactional. So these people aren't necessarily here to murder you. But they still have a high enough danger rating because in a lot of instances, and we've seen this, when people feel their identity has been compromised, or they're new to this and they're nervous about it and they've not quite planned it properly, attacks and deaths do happen, and they do happen rather frequently. So when people break in a larger scale home invasion and then think they might have been seen, might have been identified or what have you, they may then decide the decision to take it from relatively low levels of violence and coercion to high level of violence or even murder because of that fear. So Home invasion, armed robbery can come here. Same with robberies of stores, banks, what have you. People are there for the product, they're there for the money, they're there for the car on your drive, but it can turn sour, and relatively often it does. Move here to high danger, or highish danger, and relatively high frequency, and that is sexual violence. So especially if you're a woman, or even if you're an adult man in the wrong type of circumstance, sexual violence can be very, very dangerous. Can be very, very dangerous for you. Not usually during the event, but afterwards, if there's a fear of being caught, the fear of being identified. You bear in mind how much sexual violence happens where people, you know the people. They are cousins, they are friends, they are known to you. And that can freak a lot of people out and suddenly turn the sexual violence element into a high danger area. But a lot of women will have, to some degree, sexual violence happen to them, or threats of sexual violence. So the likelihood on this is relatively high over here. So the danger, relatively high, the likelihood, relatively high. Then you start to move down into this green zone here, into average street crime, so average low-level street assaults, people just giving you a couple of digs and running off laughing, people pushing you down, giving you a couple of kicks, but in reality, that kind of, what would be the best way to phrase this? It's kind of miscreant violence. So, you getting a big punch to the face and people running off and fucking off. Now, yes, one big punch to the face can knock you down and kill you if you hit your head off the curb, but kind of street, low-level scum violence is relatively low danger. It will hurt you, but no one's really looking to kill you. But it is very frequent. And the same with social violence. So especially if you're in the right age demographic for pubs, for clubs, for that kind of stuff, the chances of violence happening to or near you is relatively high, but the danger of that can be relatively low unless it is in a group social violence setting. So there's lots of people and there's only you or very few of people that are supporting you. It can suddenly go from here to here on the axis. So that's sort of a whistle-stop tour through something, and again, these change, and from person to person, these are relatively personal. But it's interesting that most combative systems and most martial arts focus on this green area here of highish likelihood but lowish danger. This is the mainstay of the martial arts industry as a whole, and a lot of people train for the one-on-one fight, which really never happens. So the one-on-one social violence is so hugely infrequent now. All those petty levels of street crime, all the argy-bargy, pushing, pulling, shouting, ragging people around, lowish level street crime and social violence. And people spend a huge, inordinate amount of time here. The problem is that even people without much training, or any training at all, can generally fare pretty well, or pretty decently, without much training here. So people that find themselves involved in one-on-one social violence, you don't need training for that really. It does help, but it's not necessarily mandatory. It's not something, it does help, it certainly does help, but there's a lowish risk to your person there, because odds are the person that is doing the violence to you is also relatively inexperienced. The people doing violence here can be relatively inexperienced, and their will to really significantly damage you is much lower. They're there to put you in a position, they're there to dominate you, they're there to elevate their social status, they're not necessarily there to kill you. As you start to move up, you can see that whilst instances of psychopathic, group social or terror-based violence, they're relatively infrequent, and even down to, those have high failure rates. In that if you fuck up here, you are truly fucked. If you fuck up in social violence, or if you fuck up in casual street violence, you'll come home bloodied and bruised and a bit battered. You might have your wallet nicked and you might feel ashamed of yourself. It'll have a psychological trauma effect on you. But it's not very likely to cause you long-lasting damage, pain, injury, death. These things will. And it's interesting how little time most people spend on things that would cause the most harm. So whilst they're very unlikely to happen, these are the things that potentially you will certainly need more training to safeguard yourself against. I'll give a very easy example. So if you look at the Paris train attacks here, terror, level 10 danger, right? So a chap manages to get the AK-47 off the terrorist in there. But because of his failure to understand how to clear a jam, that man got killed because the bad guy took out a sidearm and did him. The good guy had the opportunity and the means to kill the bad guy. He had the means to do that. He had the opportunity. He had taken off his primary weapon, taken off the terrorist's primary weapon. But because of a lack of knowledge, a relatively basic lack of knowledge, it doesn't take a genius to learn the basics of relatively ubiquitous platforms like an AK-47. Because he hadn't learned that and he didn't have that knowledge, that was extremely fatal to that man. Extremely fatal to that man. And there are many instances of where people have managed to get hold of weapons or have opportunities. Their lack of knowledge has led to their death. Lack of knowledge. And if you think about knowledge as a commodity, it's all about time investment, where you're prioritising your time and investment. And if people spend so much time looking at things that they could survive without much training, and hardly any time at all trying to survive things that require a bit of training, that's where you can start to get discrepancies, and you can start to see perhaps there's flaws in the pedagogy and the curricula which many people follow. Now you start to look at sexual violence here, and you can see that the likelihood is relatively high and the danger is relatively high. Yet very, very few clubs address this well at all, because there's a stigma, there's a taboo, and it does tend to put off the male members of that club because they're inevitably put into the position of a morally heinous bad guy. It's awkward putting strangers together in those types of intimate positions, for want of a better way to phrase it. So people like to brush this under the rug. But given the high levels of danger and the higher levels of likelihood, it takes up a relatively low proportion of most combative systems' self-protection, or where they do it, it's so neutered and so controlled and so devoid of emotional fear that it's not really worth the paper it's printed on. But again, it allows you, when you plot things like this, it helps you decide, do I want to spend most of my time training something that is likely to happen but unlikely to cause me lasting harm? Or should I spend more of my time helping train or train others against things that could cause significant, lasting or fatal harm? Now there's no easy or one answer for this, because for many people they just want to feel a bit safer when they walk home against social violence, and that's absolutely cool. But it is important to plot out and consider how much time you allocate against these different aspects of violence. Now people will say fighting's fighting, assault's are assault, being hit's being hit, but the setup, the constructs, the locations, the types of implement, there are a huge amount of factors. There are a huge amount of factors which are peculiar to each of these elements, which is really important to understand psychologically, procedurally. What does a typical terror attack look like in Western Europe? What does typical sexual violence, what can it look like? What forms does it take? Does it normally take the form of a sudden total assault, or is it slow and manipulative? There are lots of ways to peel that particular onion. But I would say, if you ever get the chance, take the time to decode what you're spending the most time training or teaching, and understanding, am I putting the right eggs in the right basket? Am I putting the right thoughts and the right impetus and the right training behind things that really matter when it really counts? It's a bit of a thought exercise. It's something that I'm doing at the moment as I start to build my curricula, as I'm coming back to open a dojo. But for me personally, for my own personal training, this is very, very, very useful to me. And when I'm training others, so if I'm training other people, I like them to tell me where are their concerns on this? What are they most worried about? To understand the different types and levels of training. And if you're an instructor as well, you might not have a great deal of experience in some of these. So you bring in subject matter experts, or you signpost to people that know. If you run a basic Krav Maga club in Reading, your knowledge of terror-based violence or sexual-based violence might be relatively small. But that's nothing to be embarrassed about as an instructor. As long as you're being credible to you and you're engaging other people and you're bringing in other subject matter experts, you can run a really holistic and useful club. So try and understand what the demographics of your audience want and need, and help yourself, build into your own mind, am I playing to the things that are most likely or most deadly or most dangerous to my audiences? Because there are two different kettles of fish, and it really does pay to plot things out like this. You could put hundreds more things on this. I wanted to make it relatively clear for you via the screen, but it's an exercise well worth going into and understanding how you, your art, your systems, your approaches match this and where you want to be. And bear in mind that during your life, this will change. If you're a young person in your 20s, if you're a young man in your late teens, early 20s, social violence is very, 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 very likely to come to knocking on your door. Sexual violence isn't. So it does make sense. But as you start to get older, perhaps the risk of home invasion as an elderly person, as potentially a softer target, that might make up more of your prioritisation, because that is perhaps now more likely than it was before. So do understand that this evolves and changes with your lifestyle and your choices and your approaches. But likelihood versus danger, I really enjoy this as a tool. It helps me reflect, kind of respond, plan how I like to train and the people I like to train with and the things I like to understand. So if you ever get a chance, if you get yourself bored, give it a go. It's a really good exercise. Cheers.